Claude responded, "My daughter-in-law forgot to hang up the phone. My daughter-in-law forgot to hang up the phone. I heard her say 6 words that changed everything. He won't even notice, Mom." I didn't say a word back. 3 months later, she and my son came home from a weekend in Napa, smiling right up until they saw the moving truck already gone. On the porch, they found a key that no longer worked and an envelope taped where the doorbell used to be. When they read what was inside, my son called me screaming, and for the first time in my life, I let it ring out. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old. For 37 years, I taught high school shop class in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina, showed thousands of kids how to build a birdhouse before they could drive a car, and thought I'd spend my last years exactly where I'd spent all the others. In the house on Amberley Ridge Road where I raised my son and buried my wife, my daughter-in-law had other plans for me. This is the story of what she almost got away with and what I did instead. My wife Donna passed 3 years ago, in the spring, from a heart that just decided it was tired. After the funeral, I kept living in that house because I didn't know what else a man was supposed to do with 37 years of furniture and a garden Donna had planted with her own hands. My son Danny called most weeks, sometimes skipped one when work got busy, and I never held it against him. About a year after Donna died, Danny and his wife Renee showed up on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine and a proposal that sounded, at the time, like the answer to a prayer I hadn't said out loud yet. "Dad, we've been talking," Danny said, standing in my kitchen the way he used to stand there as a teenager, asking to borrow the truck. "This house is too much for one person. Renee and I are still saving for our own place. Rates are killer right now. What if we moved in for a while? Help you out, keep an eye on things, and we all save some money while we figure it out." I said yes before he finished his sentence. I'd have said yes to almost anything that meant somebody else's voice in that house again. Within a month, they'd given notice on their apartment in Mount Pleasant and moved their whole life into the 2 bedrooms upstairs, the ones Donna used to call the grandbaby rooms, even though no grandbabies had come along yet. For a good while, it really did feel like a gift. Renee cooked on Sundays, real cooking, not the frozen dinners I'd been living on. Danny fixed the fence line and cleared the gutters before I even asked. We sat on the back porch, some evenings the way we used to when he was a boy, and the house stopped feeling like a museum of a life that was over. I told my neighbor Cyrus down the road that I was the luckiest widower in Berkeley County, having my own son look after me the way I used to look after him. I had no idea, not the slightest suspicion, that the woman pouring my sweet tea every night was already counting the months until that house had a different name on the deed, and it wasn't going to be mine. By month 5, little things started shifting. The kind of things a man tells himself don't mean anything because he doesn't want them to mean anything. Renee started saying our house instead of Walter's place when she talked to her sister on the porch, thinking I couldn't hear through the screen door. She had the old wallpaper in the hallway stripped and repainted without asking me first. Said it was just too dated, too sad looking. Danny started asking more about my pension from the school district, whether I still had the mortgage paid off, which I did, free and clear since 2011, the year Donna and I celebrated by planting that garden out back. I didn't think much of it at the time. A son ought to know these things, I told myself, same as I'd taught 100 boys that a man takes care of his family's business. One night over dinner, Danny mentioned that his buddy from the plant, a fellow named Roy, had just sold his late father's house in Mount Pleasant for almost $780,000, cash even, closed in 3 weeks. "Market's insane right now, Dad," he said, looking around my kitchen in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Not long after that, Renee started having her friend Deb over for coffee on Tuesday afternoons, a friend I later learned sold real estate for a living, and who had already walked through my house alone one Thursday while I was at the VA clinic, giving them a number without my knowledge, back when I still thought she was just a neighbor being sociable. Looking back now, I can see the whole shape of it laid out, clean as a blueprint. Back then, I just saw my son and his wife settling into a life under my roof, and an old widower grateful not to eat supper by himself anymore. I want you to hold on to that feeling for a minute, because it's the same trust that made everything that came after cut so deep once I finally understood what was happening inside my own home. Around month 7, Danny started saying things like, "Dad, you've been a little forgetful lately," even on days I hadn't forgotten a single thing. I left my truck keys in the door lock one Saturday morning, same as I'd done a dozen times in 40 years of driving, and by that evening Danny was telling Renee across the table, talking about me like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, that he was starting to worry about my memory. I laughed about it. Told him every man my age loses his keys sometimes. He didn't laugh with me. Not long after, he started insisting on driving me to my own doctor's appointments, even though I'd driven myself to that same clinic for 20 years without a scratch on the truck. And he'd sit right there in the exam room asking, Doctor? Alvarez pointed questions about memory screenings and early warning signs, questions I never asked for and sure didn't need answered. Renee started leaving brochures on the kitchen counter, the glossy kind with soft lighting and gray-haired actors smiling too wide, brochures for places with names like Cypress Manor and Live Oak Village. When I finally asked her straight out what all the pamphlets were for, she said, sweet as sugar, "Oh, those are just for down the road, Walter, just in case." Down the road. That was her exact phrase, and I heard it the way you hear a floor creak under weight that shouldn't be there. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the bitter old man accusing his own family over a stack of brochures. So I kept my mouth shut, kept saying thank you for looking out for me, while some part of me, the same part that had spent 37 years reading teenage boys who swore up and down they hadn't broken the bandsaw, started listening a whole lot closer to every word coming out of that kitchen. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I'd gone out to the shed behind the garden looking for a pair of pruning shears I hadn't touched since Donna passed, just puttering the way old men do when the house gets too quiet. When I heard Renee's voice drifting out from the kitchen window, I'd left cracked for the breeze. She was on the phone, talking low and fast, and I could tell from her tone she believed she was the only living soul on that property. No, listen to me, she was saying. Dr. Alvarez already put it in his chart that his memory's slipping. That's documented now. That's exactly what we need. Once we get him settled at Cypress Manor, the paperwork basically files itself. I stood dead still in that shed doorway, with a pair of rusted shears in my hand. My pulse going so hard I was sure she'd hear it clean through the screen. She kept talking. Deb already ran the comps. With the market the way it is, we're sitting right around $780,000 for that house. Maybe more if we list before the holidays. That covers a nice place for him for years, and there's plenty left over for us to finally get our own start. Danny must have said something on his end of the call, because Renee laughed, actually laughed, and said, "He won't even notice, Mom." That's just the truth of it. It's not personal. It's just what makes sense for everybody. He won't even notice. 6 words. I stood in that shed doorway for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 90 seconds, and I did not make one single sound. I set those shears down as gentle as I'd picked them up, walked back across the yard, and sat down on Donna's garden bench, in the October sun like the whole world hadn't just tilted sideways under my feet, even though it had. I want to be straight with you about something. My first instinct standing in that shed was to march into my own kitchen and ask my daughter-in-law exactly what kind of woman says her father-in-law won't even notice being shipped off. Like I was an old riding mower nobody had use for anymore. But I didn't do it. 37 years standing in front of teenage boys teaches you something that has nothing to do with power tools. It teaches you how to keep your face still while somebody's lying to you, long enough to figure out their whole plan before you ever open your mouth. So that night at supper, I ate Renee's pork chops and asked Danny how the plant was running, same as any other Tuesday. I didn't say a word about the phone call. Didn't mention Cypress Manor, or the $780,000, or the fact that my own daughter-in-law had just described getting rid of me, the same way you'd talk about trading in a truck with too many miles on it. I went to bed that night and did not sleep 1 minute. I lay there in the dark, turning over every sweet little comment Renee had made about those brochures, every doctor's visit Danny had suddenly started attending, every question about my pension and my paid-off mortgage. It all lined up now, every last piece, like a puzzle I'd been too trusting to see the picture of. Sometime around 3 in the morning, lying awake in the house I'd owned since before my son could walk, the house where I'd raised the very boy who now wanted me gone, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to accuse a soul of anything. I was simply going to find out exactly where I stood, legally and otherwise, before either one of them got the chance to make their next move. The following Monday, I told Danny I had a follow-up appointment across the river, and I drove myself there in my own truck, the same 2009 Silverado I'd had since it rolled off the lot. Instead of the clinic, I drove to see a lawyer named Miriam Castellano, whose office sat over a hardware store on King Street, a woman I'd known 30 years back when her father used to bring his boys into my shop class. I sat across from her desk and laid the whole thing out, the phone call, the brochures, the questions about my finances, every bit of it plain and in order. Miriam listened without interrupting once, taking notes in that careful lawyer's hand. and when I finished, she pulled up the county records right there on her monitor. Mr. Higgins, she said, I need you to hear this clearly. That house is deeded solely in your name. Yours alone. Nobody else's name is anywhere on that title, and unless you've signed a power of attorney or some other document handing over your authority, nobody can sell that house, place you anywhere, or touch 1 cent of your money without your say-so. Then she asked me a question that dropped straight through my stomach. Has your son had you sign anything recently? Anything he called insurance paperwork or medical forms, something routine sounding like that. And it hit me instantly, a stack of papers Danny had left on my kitchen table almost 3 weeks earlier, telling me they were updated homeowners insurance documents that needed my signature for the album. I hadn't gotten around to signing them, kept meaning to, kept putting it off since I don't sign a thing without my reading glasses and a clear head first thing in the morning. Miriam had me bring those papers straight to her office, and 2 days later she confirmed exactly what we'd both already started to suspect. They weren't insurance papers at all. They were a durable power of attorney, one that would have handed Danny complete legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my home. I never signed that document, and I never will. But finding it changed something in me for good. I wasn't just a widower being whispered about behind closed doors anymore. I was a man whose own son had tried to trick him into signing his whole life away over a stack of papers dressed up to look boring and ordinary. Miriam Castellano walked me through my options and put me in touch with a realtor she trusted without hesitation, a sharp, quiet woman named Fatima Okafor, who worked out of a small office near the market and had a reputation for closing deals fast and discreet when a client needed exactly that. I met Fatima at a diner off Highway 17, paid cash for both our coffees, and told her plainly that I wanted my house sold without my son or his wife knowing one thing about it until it was already finished business. Fatima didn't ask me why. She just nodded slow, like she'd sat across from men like me before, more than a few times, and told me a house like mine, 3 bedrooms, a fenced half-acre, a garden most buyers would kill for, could pull close to $780,000 if we moved fast and moved quiet. I opened a new account at a credit union clear across the county that Danny had never heard of, had my mail rerouted to a box at the post office, and started meeting Fatima every Thursday afternoon while Danny and Renee believed I was at physical therapy for my knee. For the first time in months, I felt like I was holding the good hand again, and it felt better than I know how to put into words. To keep the two of them calm and unsuspecting, I did something that still makes me chuckle a little, even now. I let them walk me through Cypress Manor on a Saturday tour. I strolled those hallways smelling like fresh paint and lemon polish, nodded along at the bingo schedule pinned up in the activity room, even told the tour guide the dining hall was real nice, all while knowing full well I had no intention of ever laying my head down in that place. Danny looked so relieved in the car afterward, telling Renee over speakerphone that Dad seemed to really be coming around to it, that I almost felt a flicker of pity for the boy. Almost. Meanwhile, Fatima had my house listed privately. The kind of listing that never touches the big websites Danny or Renee might stumble across on their phones, marketed quiet through a small circle of serious buyers. Inside 11 days, we had 2 solid offers. The strongest one came from a young couple named Marcus and Aisha Bell, expecting their second child, who fell hard for the garden Donna had spent a decade building with her own 2 hands. Their offer landed at $780,000, all cash, quick close, no contingencies, exactly the clean deal Miriam had told me to hold out for. I sat in Fatima's office and signed that agreement with a steadier hand than I expected, thinking about Renee's voice drifting out that kitchen window, saying he won't even notice like it was the plainest fact in the world. Well, Renee, I remember thinking as I signed my name, somebody sure is about to notice something. About 2 weeks after I signed, Danny came home from the plant, lit up like he hadn't been in months. His company was flying a group of them out to a training conference in Napa Valley. A full week, wine country, all expenses covered. And Renee was already talking about the spa day she'd booked and dinner at some place with a French name. Timing couldn't be better, Dad, Danny told me over supper, not knowing exactly how right he was. While we're gone, maybe you think some more on Cypress Manor. Could even put a deposit down before we're back. Get things moving. I told him I'd give it some thought. Same easy voice I'd been using for weeks. And inside I was doing arithmetic. Miriam and Fatima had already lined it up, so closing could happen in as few as 10 days once both sides signed. And the Bells, pre-approved and itching to move, were ready the moment I gave the word. Danny and Renee left for the airport early on a Friday, bags stacked by the front door, Renee reminding me twice to keep her ferns watered while they were gone. I stood on the porch and waved as Danny's Honda backed down the same driveway he used to skateboard down as a boy, and the moment that car turned the corner past the Hendersons' mailbox and disappeared, I picked up the phone and called Fatima and told her one simple thing. Move the closing up. Let's get it done this week while they're gone, before either one of them ever gets the chance to come home and try to stop what's already rolling downhill. The closing happened that Wednesday, 4 days into their trip, in a small back office at the title company off Rivers Avenue. Marcus and Aisha Bell sat across from me, Aisha's hand resting easy on her belly, both of them practically vibrating about raising their kids in that yard. I signed page after page, feeling lighter with every stroke of the pen, and when it was finally done, Fatima slid me a check for $780,000 minus fees, more money than I'd ever held in one place in my whole life. I'd already found my own new spot, a bright little independent living cottage at a community out toward Somerville called Ashford Pines, with a screened porch, a raised garden bed, already built into the ground out back, and a wood shop attached to the community center I could putter in whenever the mood struck. Nobody handed me that place off a glossy pamphlet. I found it myself, walked it myself, paid cash for it myself, and signed my own lease with my own name. I spent that Wednesday afternoon and the whole next day with two movers I'd hired quiet weeks in advance, packing up 40 years of a life, Donna's china, my father's old level and hand plane, every photograph off every wall, everything that actually mattered, and left the rest for the young family who was tickled to take the furniture off my hands for a fair price. By Thursday evening, the house on Amberley Ridge Road belonged, lock and title, to Marcus and Aisha Bell. The locksmith Fatima had lined up came through right on schedule, and I sat in my new living room out at Ashford Pines watching the sun drop behind the pines with a cup of coffee warming my hands, feeling more peace than I'd felt in longer than a year, maybe longer than I could rightly count. Before I left Amberley Ridge Road that last time, I sat down at the kitchen table where Donna and I had eaten breakfast together for 33 years and wrote one final letter, not out of spite, just out of honesty. I taped it to the doorframe right where I knew Danny's key would fail to turn, right at eye level, in an envelope with his name written across the front, in the same hand I used to sign his report cards. I told him I knew everything. I told him I'd been standing in that garden shed on a Tuesday afternoon with pruning shears in my hand when I heard Renee tell her mother on the phone that I wouldn't even notice, and that I'd heard her talk about $780,000 like it was already spent and gone. I told him the house had sold, clean and legal, to a good young family who'd earned it a lot more than two people who'd spent the better part of a year plotting how to tuck their own father out of sight. I told him I wasn't angry, not really, just carrying a disappointment that sat heavier than anger ever could, and that I hoped one day he'd understand exactly what it feels like to be the person somebody else has quietly decided is in the way. I told him not to bother trying the old cell number, since I'd already shut that account down, but that I'd pick up the day he called me and actually meant it. I signed it the same way I'd signed every card to that boy since he was 6 years old, love, Dad. Then I locked that door for the very last time, climbed into my truck, and drove off from Amberley Ridge Road without one glance in the mirror. Danny told me later, though I didn't hear it straight from him until a good 3 weeks after, that he and Renee pulled into that driveway on a Friday evening, still sunburnt and loose from their trip, Renee already chattering about her ferns and unpacking. Danny walked up to that front door with his key out, same as he'd done 10,000 times before, and it simply would not turn. He figured the lock was jammed, jiggled it, tried it twice more, called back to Renee that something was wrong with the door. That's when a man he'd never laid eyes on opened it from the inside, Marcus Bell, holding his toddler on one hip, wanting to know just who exactly was trying to get into his family's house. According to my neighbor Cyrus, who watched the whole thing unfold from his own front steps across the street, Danny stood frozen on that porch a long moment before he even noticed the envelope taped beside the door frame with his name written across the front. Cyrus told me Renee read it first, standing right there on the front walk in the last of the evening light, and that her hands were shaking before she'd made it halfway down the page. He said Danny took the letter out of her hands when she couldn't finish it, read the rest himself standing there, and that's when the yelling started, right out on that front lawn. Loud enough that the Hendersons and two other neighbors stepped out onto their own porches to see what in the world was going on. Cyrus said Renee sat straight down on the grass. Danny just stood there, holding that letter, staring at a house that didn't have a single thing left inside it that belonged to him, in front of a young family he'd never once met, on a street he'd figured he'd own free and clear inside a year. My phone started ringing about 6 minutes later. I let it go. Danny called me 20 some times over the next 4 days, and I let every single one roll to voicemail. Not out of meanness, but because I wanted him to sit a good while inside the exact feeling he'd been so ready to hand to me. On the fifth day, sitting out on my little screened porch at Ashford Pines, with the evening turning gold over the pines, I finally picked up. His voice broke the second I said his name. Dad, please. We didn't mean it the way it sounded. We can fix this. Just tell us where you are. I let him talk himself out for a good long while, let him work through the apologies and the excuses about money, troubles, and stress, and how things had just gotten away from the two of them. And when he finally ran dry, I told him the truth, plain as I could manage. I told him I'd stood in that shed and heard every word of that phone call in October, that I knew about the power of attorney dressed up as insurance forms, that I'd known exactly what Cypress Manor and $780,000 meant to him and Renee months before I ever breathed a word of it. I told him I wasn't going to raise my voice at him, because he was still my son and I still loved him. But that loving him didn't mean I owed him a house I'd spent 37 years of chalk dust and paychecks paying off, especially not after he'd already decided, all on his own, that I wouldn't even notice being gone. I told him I was happy, truly happy, in a place I'd picked out for myself, around people my own age who treated me like a man and not a problem to be scheduled around. Before I hung up, I told him the door wasn't shut forever, but that it would only crack back open once he was ready to see me as his father again, and not as $780,000 standing between him and everything he'd already decided he was owed. I set the phone down next to my coffee and looked out over those pine trees one more time, feeling, for the first time in more years than I care to count, completely and finally at peace. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already know exactly what it feels like the day a quiet man finally decides he's done being quiet. Claude responded, being loved doesn't mean being convenient, and the years you've earned are never a burden someone else gets to price. Being loved doesn't mean being convenient, and the years you've earned are never a burden someone else gets to price. Walter didn't win by shouting. He won by trusting himself, moving quietly, and choosing his own next chapter instead of the one handed to him. That's the real gift of growing older. The freedom to say, my life is still mine to write, and to write it with peace instead of anger. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI, purely for entertainment, though we hope its little life lesson stays with you a while.